The snow didn't fall in flakes. It came down in sheets, a solid wall of white that swallowed the world whole. And out in that frozen emptiness, a 58-year-old woman named Barbara Whitfield was fighting for her life. Her shoulders, once strong enough to carry a husband's rage and then the silence of his grave, were now bowed against a wind that wanted to tear her apart. Her hair, white as the snow itself, whipped across a face etched with lines the town never let her forget. She was old, she was a widow, and in their eyes, that meant she was useless. She saw a light, a faint orange glow in the distance. A cabin. Hope was a dangerous thing, but it was all she had left. She stumbled up the rise, her voice a raw whisper against the storm. "I am too old, sir, but I can cook." It was a prayer and a resume, and the wind snatched it away before it could be heard. Her knuckles, frozen and raw, rapped against a heavy wood door. She didn't know if she wanted an answer or not. The town had already given her their answer, over and over. "She's half a ghost," Martha Riley had sneered at the trading post just last week, her voice like cracking ice. "Too old for love, too useless for work." The other women had laughed, a sound like birds pecking at a corpse. Now, standing at this strange door in the middle of a blizzard, Barbara felt that laughter echo in her bones. She was ready to be turned away, to fade into the white like they all wanted. Then the door opened. A wave of heat and the smell of roasting meat washed over her, and in the doorway stood a man who looked like he'd been carved from the mountain itself. He was Apache, tall and broad, with scars across his chest and eyes that held the storm like a pet. He couldn't have been more than 32. Next to his raw power, his youth, Barbara felt every one of her 58 years. She felt like a dried leaf next to a burning log. Shame washed over her, cold and sharp. She bowed her head, ready for the dismissal. "I can cook," she repeated, her voice a fragile flicker. "That's all I can offer." The man, Chenoa, didn't laugh. He didn't sneer. He just looked at her, his gaze steady and deep, like a frozen river. Snow hissed at their feet, melting where the cabin's warmth touched it. He was studying her, weighing something she couldn't see, and Barbara braced herself for the door to close, for the final rejection that would send her back into the storm to die. But he didn't close the door. With a slow, deliberate movement, he just stepped aside and let her in. The cabin was simple, just one room against the storm. Pelts on the floor, a rough-hewn table, a fire crackling in the hearth. Barbara stood dripping in the center of the room, an awkward, shivering ghost. The silence was thick, pressing in on her from all sides. Any other time, she would have thanked him and left. But the storm was a beast, and her bones ached with a cold that went deeper than weather. She was tired of fighting. She was just so tired. Her hands, red and chapped, reached for the fire. The warmth was so intense it felt like pain, and it brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them away, refusing to show weakness. Not here. Across the hearth, Chenoa sat, silently carving a piece of cedar wood. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from. He just watched her, the way a man watches a wild thing that has wandered into his camp, trying to decide if it will bolt. Barbara's mind drifted back to town, to the sneers and the pity. All her life, her hands had worked. They'd cooked and cleaned and mended and healed. Now, the town treated those same hands as if they were empty. Her voice, thin but clear, broke the silence. "I can make bread from scraps, stretch a stew to feed 3 from a meal for 1. She looked at him, her gaze pleading. "If you let me stay the night, I will prove my worth." Chenoa's dark eyes flickered from her face to the pot over the fire. He didn't speak. He just gestured toward it. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't an order. It was just space. Permission. She understood. Her body was stiff, but her hands remembered. She found beans, a bone with shreds of meat, some dried herbs. The simple rhythm of cooking steadied her. Here, stirring a pot, she wasn't a joke. She wasn't a ghost. She was a woman with a purpose. When the stew was thick and fragrant, she ladled it into a bowl and placed it before him. He took it without a word, ate a spoonful, and then set it down. His eyes met hers, and something new was in them. Not pity, respect. Exhaustion finally claimed her. She sank down by the fire, a fragile peace settling over her. For a moment, she dared to imagine a life here, a place where she belonged not for her face or her age, but for the work of her hands. But the town's poison was deep in her blood. Too old. Too useless. The words hissed in her mind, and she bent her head, ashamed of her own flicker of hope. Just then, a gust of wind rattled the shutters, a violent, angry sound. Chenoa rose, bolted the heavy door, and placed another log on the fire. He sat back down, his knife still, and finally he spoke. "Storm long," he said, his voice low and earthy. "You stay." The words weren't a question. They were a statement, a fact. Barbara's breath hitched. She could only nod, the warmth of the fire on her face mingling with a strange, new warmth inside her chest. The storm howled outside, a song of cold and death. Inside, two strangers sat in silence, separated by a fire. But Barbara knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that the fire wasn't the only thing between them. As she drifted towards sleep, she heard him whisper something in his own tongue. A prayer, it sounded like. A prayer about the storm, or his ancestors. Or maybe, just maybe, about her. And her heart, which she thought had turned to dust long ago, began to beat again. The storm broke after 3 days, leaving the world wrapped in a blanket of silent, glittering white. Barbara walked into town with an empty sack, her steps crunching a lonely rhythm in the snow. She knew what was waiting for her. She could already feel their eyes on her back. The trading post was a cage of smells, kerosene, wet wool, and judgment. The moment she stepped inside, the low hum of conversation died. Every head turned. Martha Riley was first, of course, her voice sharp as a needle, cut through the quiet. "Well, look who the storm spit out," she said, a cruel smile twisting her lips. "I'd have thought a woman your age would have the sense to stay put. Might break a hip no one's around to mend." A few women tittered. The sound was like mice skittering over a grave. Barbara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She ignored them, her hands trembling as she reached for a small sack of flour. Deputy Carl Jennings was leaning against the stove, his badge glinting. He was a man who loved the sound of his own voice, especially when it was causing pain. "Careful there, Grandma Whitfield," he called out, his grin wide and ugly. "That flour's for families. Not much sense in an old ghost taking up good supplies." The laughter was louder this time. Barbara gripped the sack so tightly her knuckles went white. She wanted to scream, to tell them she had a right to be there, a right to eat, but the words were stuck in her throat, choked by years of shame. Elias Boone, a man whose kindness was a form of pity, mumbled, "Let her be. She pays her coin." It quieted them, but it didn't help. Pity was just another cage. She placed her coins on the counter, the clink echoing in the tense silence. As she turned to leave, Martha's voice followed her like a whip. "She's spending her nights with that Apache, you know. Seems age ain't a cure for indecency." The words hit her like a physical blow. She didn't look back. She just walked out into the blinding white, her body rigid. The sack of flour felt as heavy as a tombstone. Back at the cabin, Chenoa was sharpening a knife by the fire. He looked up when she entered, his eyes taking in the sack, then her face. He knew. He could see the town's venom all over her. She tried to busy herself, to pretend nothing had happened, but the silence was too heavy. "They talk," she whispered, her voice cracking. They say I should have faded away by now." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. Chenoa set his knife down. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just took the iron tongs and nudged a log in the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The flames leaped higher, casting a warm glow on her cold hands. His silence wasn't empty. It was an invitation, a safe space. "Even my husband," she murmured, staring at her worn hands. "He said I was fading, and after he died, I believed him." Her voice dropped even lower. "But then you—" She couldn't finish. She was too ashamed of the hope he had given her. Chenoa's gaze never left her face. He reached for a bowl, filled it with the stew she had made, and set it gently in front of her. His hand lingered on the rim for a second. It wasn't pity. It was acknowledgement. It was strength. She took the bowl, the simple weight of it in her hands a strange comfort. That night, she lay awake, the town's cruel words circling in her head. But this time, they sounded different, fainter, muted by the memory of his quiet strength, by the simple act of a bowl of stew offered in respect. Maybe they saw a ghost. Maybe they always would. But here, in the warm glow of this fire, she wasn't invisible. Just before she fell asleep, she heard him again, whispering in his own language. And this time, she was sure of it. She didn't know the words, but she knew the sound of her own name. A new feeling, fragile but fierce, took root in her heart. She wasn't dreaming of endings anymore. She was dreaming of a beginning she couldn't yet see. But the town wasn't done with her. The whispers grew into a roar. One morning, as she gathered firewood near the edge of the clearing, she found something half buried in the snow. A small, carved wooden bird. Her breath caught in her throat. It was identical to one her husband had carved for her, years ago. One she had lost the night he died. Her blood ran cold. How could it be here? She ran back to the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She burst through the door, holding out the small bird. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Chenoa looked at the bird and then at her. His face was a mask of stone. "I found it," he said slowly. "Years ago. By the creek, behind your old house." The cabin seemed to shrink around her. This wasn't a chance meeting. This wasn't a random act of kindness in a storm. This was something else entirely. You knew who I was," she whispered, the realization dawning on her like a cold, terrifying sun. "You knew when I came to your door." He nodded once, his dark eyes holding hers. "I knew." The air crackled with unspoken history. The shelter he had given her suddenly felt like a trap. The kindness felt like a lie. Who was this man? And what did he want with the ghost of Barbara Whitfield? He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "The town whispers about how your husband died," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They say it was an accident. They lie." Barbara stumbled back, the wooden bird falling from her nerveless fingers. The storm outside was over, but a new one, far more terrible, was just beginning. The carved bird lay on the floor between them, a silent accusation. "My husband," Barbara started, her voice a dry rasp. "He fell. It was dark. He was clumsy." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, a lie she had told herself and the town for years, a lie that had hollowed her out from the inside. Chenoa didn't move. His eyes were like black stones, seeing right through the pathetic story she had constructed. "He was not clumsy," Chenoa said, his voice flat and hard. "He was a monster, and he carried a knife." Barbara flinched as if he had struck her. The memories came rushing back, a flood of bile and fear. Her husband's heavy footsteps on the stairs, the smell of whiskey on his breath, the glint of steel in the lamplight, the endless nights of his rage, his fists, the names he called her. She had buried it all under a mountain of shame, pretending it never happened. But this man, this stranger, he was digging it all up. "How could you know that?" she whispered, her body trembling. My father was a tracker, Chenoa said, his voice softening just a fraction. Sometimes your husband hired him. I was a boy then. I would wait for my father at the edge of your property. I saw things. I heard things. He looked down at the floor. I saw the bruises you tried to hide with your shawl. I heard you crying when you thought no one could hear. The shame was suffocating. This man, this near stranger, knew her deepest, darkest secret. A secret she had guarded with her life. He had been a silent witness to her private hell. That night, he continued, his gaze lifting to meet hers again. The night he died. There was a storm, like this one. I heard shouting. I was afraid for you. I crept closer to the house. I saw him drag you outside. I saw the knife. Barbara squeezed her eyes shut, but the images were burned onto the inside of her eyelids. The struggle in the mud and the snow, the searing pain as he twisted her arm, the cold metallic feel of the blade against her throat. I found this, Chenoa said, nudging the carved bird with his boot. After the deputy left, it was covered in blood. Your blood. A sob escaped her lips, a raw, wounded sound she hadn't made in years. The truth was out, laid bare on the floor of this smoky cabin. He knew. He had always known. The kindness he had shown her wasn't random. It was a debt. A penance for a boy who had watched from the shadows and done nothing. Why? She choked out. Why let me in? Why now? Because the storm brought you to my door, he said simply. And this time, I was not a boy hiding in the trees. I am a man. And I will not let the storm take you. He was offering her more than shelter from the snow. He was offering her shelter from her past. But the past had a long reach. Just then, a horse thundered into the clearing. Deputy Carl Jennings swung himself out of the saddle, his face a mask of drunken fury. He kicked the door open without knocking, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Barbara. There you are, he snarled, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. We need to have a talk, you and I. About old times. His eyes flicked to Chenoa, a sneer twisting his lips. And you need to stay out of business that ain't yours, savage. Jennings wasn't just a bully. He was a co-conspirator. He was the one who had come that night, the one who had looked at her husband's body and her battered face, and told her to call it an accident. He was the keeper of her lie, and he had come to make sure she kept it. The deputy's presence filled the small cabin with a thick, sour menace. He wasn't there for a friendly chat. He was there to deliver a warning. Town's getting restless, Barbara, Jennings said, his eyes never leaving her face. He completely ignored Chenoa, as if the larger man was nothing more than a piece of furniture. They don't like you shacking up out here. It's unseemly. I'm not shacking up, Barbara said, her voice stronger than she expected. I was caught in the storm. Jennings let out a short, barking laugh. Storm's been over for days. No, this is something else. This is you getting ideas. And I'm here to tell you to put those ideas right out of your head. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. Some things are better left buried. You remember that, don't you? You were always good at keeping quiet. He was talking about her husband. He was reminding her of their shared, ugly secret. He was putting her back in her cage. The years of fear and silence washed over her, and she felt herself shrinking, fading, becoming the ghost the town wanted her to be. But Chenoa moved. He didn't say a word. He just stepped between them. He was a solid wall of muscle and silent rage. Jennings, for the first time, looked uneasy. He wasn't used to being challenged. This is official town business, he blustered, trying to regain his footing. This woman is a ward of this town, and I... He never got to finish. Chenoa's hand shot out, grabbing the front of Jennings's coat. He lifted the sputtering deputy clean off his feet, his knuckles white. She is not your ward, Chenoa said, his voice a deadly quiet rumble. And this is not your business." He carried Jennings to the door like a sack of garbage and threw him out into the snow. The deputy landed with a surprised grunt, scrambling to his feet, his face purple with rage and humiliation. "You'll regret this!" he screamed, wiping snow from his coat. "Both of you! This ain't over!" He mounted his horse and galloped away, leaving a trail of curses hanging in the cold air. The silence he left behind was heavy, charged. Barbara was trembling, not from cold, but from a terrifying mix of fear and exhilaration. No one had ever stood up for her like that. Ever. But the exhilaration quickly faded, replaced by cold dread. Jennings would be back, and he wouldn't be alone. She had brought this trouble to Chenoa's door. Her past was a poison, and she had just infected the one person who had shown her kindness. "He'll come back with men," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "He'll kill you." Chenoa's face was grim. He bolted the door and turned to face her. "Let him come." "No," she said, shaking her head frantically. "You don't understand. He's the law. They'll believe whatever he says. He'll say you attacked him, that you took me. They'll hang you." She couldn't bear it. She had survived her husband. She had survived the town's scorn. She would not be the reason this man died. That night, after Chenoa was asleep, she made a decision. She packed a small bundle, a piece of bread, the carved bird, and slipped out of the cabin. The snow was deep, the air frigid. She didn't know where she was going. It didn't matter. All that mattered was getting away, drawing the danger away from him. She was a ghost, after all. It was time she started acting like one. She hadn't made it 100 yards before a voice cut through the darkness. "You leave?" She froze, her back to him. She couldn't face him. She couldn't see the disappointment in his eyes. "I have to," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I bring you nothing but trouble. They'll destroy you because of me." Footsteps crunched in the snow behind her. He was close now. She could feel the heat of his body. "They say I shame you," she choked out, the town's words finally breaking her. "I'm too old. I am nothing. I am a shadow." He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently turn her around. His eyes, even in the moonlight, were burning with an intensity that stole her breath. He slowly unfastened the heavy wool cloak from his own shoulders and draped it around her. It was heavy and warm, smelling of pine smoke and him. "You are not a shadow," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't name. "You are fire. You survived a monster. You survived a town of cowards. You keep breath in your body when the storm tries to kill it." He took her hands in his grip firm and steady. "That is not nothing. That is worth. That is everything." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the years of shame, cracking open the cage she had built around her own heart. She stared at him, tears streaming down her face, soaking the collar of his cloak. He wasn't just offering her shelter anymore. He was offering her a sword. But was she strong enough to take it? The next morning, Elias Boone's cart rattled into the clearing. The old man had a load of firewood, an excuse to check on the town's latest scandal. He watched Barbara moving around the cabin, her silver hair like a halo in the winter sun. He cleared his throat, spitting a wad of tobacco into the snow. "Afternoon, Chenoa," he said, his eyes flicking from the Apache to Barbara and back again. "The talk in town, it's getting ugly. Jennings is stirring things up. He's telling folks you've taken this woman against her will, that she's your servant." The word hung in the air, ripe with insult. Barbara froze, her hands full of kindling. The shame, the old familiar poison began to seep back in. She braced herself for Chenoa's anger, for his denial, but Chenoa just stood there, tall and unmoving as an ancient tree. He looked at Barbara, a long, steady gaze that seemed to see right into her soul. Then he turned his eyes back to Elias Boone. His voice was calm, clear, and carried the weight of a solemn vow. Not servant, he said. Wife. The word fell into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Elias Boone's jaw dropped. Barbara's breath caught in her lungs, the kindling slipping from her numb fingers and scattering at her feet. Wife? The word was a ghost from another lifetime, a word that had meant pain and servitude and fear. She had never, ever expected to hear it again, and certainly not like this, not spoken with such quiet, unshakable dignity. She stared at Chenoa, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a confession of love. It was a declaration of war. In his culture, she knew, the word meant something profound. It meant protection. It meant she was one of his people. An attack on her was an attack on him. He was drawing a line in the snow, daring the town to cross it. Elias Boone, after a moment of stunned silence, slowly broke into a wide, gap-toothed grin. He tipped his hat. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, a newfound respect in his eyes. "Good day to you then, Mrs. Chenoa." He turned his cart around and headed back toward town. The news he carried more explosive than a stick of dynamite. Barbara's mind was reeling. She was his wife. He had claimed her, in front of a witness. She looked at him, searching his face for some sign of regret, of calculation. But all she saw was a fierce, unwavering resolve. He had chained himself to her past, to her fight. A part of her was terrified. The town would explode. Jennings would be incandescent with rage. Martha Riley would choke on her own venom. But another part of her, a part she thought had died long ago, felt a flicker of something wild and powerful. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone in the storm. And the storm was coming. Later that day, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The wind began to howl, ripping through the trees. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. And then they saw it. A line of torches, like angry fireflies, bobbing through the woods, heading straight for the cabin. Jennings was making his move. He wasn't coming with the law. He was coming with a mob. This wasn't about decency anymore. This was about silencing her and the man who stood with her, for good. The mob surrounded the cabin, their faces twisted and ugly in the flickering torchlight. They were a pack of wolves, led by Jennings, who sat on his horse like a conquering king. Martha Riley was there, her face a mask of righteous fury, shrieking about sin and shame. "Come on out, Barbara," Jennings yelled, his voice slurred with whiskey and power. "We're here to save you from this savage." Save me, Barbara thought, a bitter laugh bubbling in her throat. He was there to bury me. Chenoa stood in the center of the room, calm and ready. He hadn't picked up a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence was weapon enough. He looked at Barbara, his dark eyes asking a silent question. "Are you ready?" She looked at the angry faces outside. She heard their jeers and their threats. The ghost of Barbara Whitfield, the woman who bent her head and endured, wanted to hide in the corner and pray for it all to be over. But that woman was dying. And in her place, someone new was being born. Someone forged in fire and shame, someone who had been claimed as a wife, as a warrior. She took a deep breath, walked to the door, and unbolted it. She stepped out into the torchlight, with Chenoa a solid, unmovable shadow right behind her. The sight of her, not cowering but standing tall, silenced the mob for a heartbeat. Martha Riley recovered first. "Look at her!" she shrieked. "Shameless! An old crone playing the harlot with an animal." The crowd roared its approval. "She's a disgrace to this town. Run the savage out. String him up." The air was thick with hate. Jennings dismounted, a cruel smile on his face. "It's over, Barbara. We're taking you back to town, for your own good. And as for him," he jerked his chin at Chenoa, "he's trespassing. We'll be dealing with him accordingly." The threat was clear. They were going to lynch him. This was it, the moment of truth. Years of scorn, of being called useless, of being told she was nothing, had led to this. She could let them win. She could let them drag her away and murder the only man who had ever seen her as more than a ghost. Or she could fight. Chenoa's hand found hers in the darkness. His grip was warm, steady. It was all the strength she needed. "You call him a savage?" Barbara's voice rang out, clear and sharp as a breaking branch in the winter quiet. The mob faltered, surprised to hear her speak at all, let alone with such force. "The only savage I see here is you, Carl Jennings, a man who hides his crimes behind a badge." Jennings's face went pale. "You shut your mouth, old woman." "No," she said, her voice rising with every word, empowered by the truth she had held back for so long. "I will not be silent anymore. You want to talk about what happened to my husband? Let's talk about it." A gasp went through the crowd. This was the town's most delicious, most forbidden secret. "He didn't fall on his knife," Barbara declared, her eyes locked on Jennings. "He tried to kill me. He had me on the ground, the blade at my throat, and I took it from him, and I drove it into his black heart." The silence was absolute. You could have heard a snowflake land. The mob was no longer a mob. They were an audience, captivated and horrified. "And you," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper as she pointed a trembling finger at the deputy. "You were there. You saw it all. You saw the bruises. You saw his rage. You saw me fight for my life. And what did you do? You told me to keep quiet. You told me to call it an accident to protect his name. You buried the truth to protect a monster, and you left me to live in a prison of shame." The truth, once unleashed, was a cleansing fire. It burned through the lies, through the years of whispers and scorn. The crowd turned as one, their accusing eyes leaving Barbara and settling on the sputtering, terrified deputy. Elias Boone stepped forward from the crowd, his face grim. He looked at Jennings, then at Barbara, and in that moment, he saw not pity, but truth. He walked up to Jennings and calmly took the pistol from the deputy's shaking hand. "I reckon," Elias said, his voice slow and steady. "The circuit judge is going to want to hear about this." It was over. The power had shifted. The mob dissolved, the townsfolk backing away from Jennings as if he were diseased, their faces a mixture of shock and shame. Martha Riley stood frozen, her mouth open, for once in her life, speechless. Justice had finally come to town. Not on the back of a horse, but in the voice of a woman they had tried to erase. They walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, the snow falling gently around them now, covering the tracks of the mob, washing the world clean. The storm was finally, truly over. Inside, the fire was still glowing, a warm and welcoming heart in the center of their small world. Barbara sank to the floor, not in exhaustion, but in release. The weight she had carried for decades was gone. She was no longer a widow. She was no longer a ghost. She was a survivor. Chenoa knelt beside her, his presence a comforting warmth. He placed his hand over hers on the hearthstone. No words were needed. Everything had been said. In the quiet of the cabin, with the snow whispering against the windows, Barbara Whitfield finally knew who she was. She was not old. She was not useless. She was fire, and she was free. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever let the world tell you who you are, I hope you remember Barbara's story. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up, even if it takes you a lifetime. It's about finding the one person who sees the fire inside you and hands you a match. And when you find that strength, you use it to speak your truth, no matter how loud the world tells you to be quiet. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. And never, ever let anyone make you feel like a ghost.